about this. This is, like Jen said, my passion. It's a passion project, and I'll get to how I came to be standing in front of you talking about media bias, being a patent lawyer, but a couple of other things first. The talk tonight is called Media Bias Chart, mapping a modern media landscape. Most importantly, why it's important, why we want to do it, and how. Because those are really the areas where I get questions. So the company that I started is called Ad Fontes Media. So Ad Fontes is Latin for to the source. And as we go along, it'll become more apparent why I chose that name for this company. But I'll talk about where it is right now. So the media bias chart, a lot of you have seen it on the internet. Maybe you have seen other versions of it, previous versions over the last 2 years. This is about its 4th iteration, and it's really 2 things. One, it's a new taxonomy for discussing the media landscape. It's a system of classification, and it's a methodology for rating quality and bias on that taxonomy. So first I had to create the world in which to talk about it, and then create the methodology for placing things in a fixed time and space on that chart. It's hard to do just because there are so many moving parts to it. We'll get into that. But tonight what I wanted to cover are a few things. First, why a chart? Why it resonates, and why so many people have just shared it online. I think it would be something of interest to you, and why it's actually helpful and what we can do with it. Those are other questions I get all the time, so I thought we'd cover that. I wanted to do an overview of the taxonomy. So we'll go through and define what the axes and the categories are, and then talk about the methodology. How do we actually determine what sources to put where on the chart? And this is really where I'll get it. I can get into the details as granular as you want. I love talking about this stuff. It's I call people who follow my blog news nerds because we just love the news and we love analyzing it. And you're at the Denver Press Club on a Thursday evening, so you all are probably news nerds too. So the methodology is content analysis driven, rather than consumer perception driven. So consumer perception driven meaning polls, asking people who are reading the sources what they think about the sources. There's a lot of that out there, and this is not that. This is looking at the actual source itself and what it can tell us. And we do that on a story by story and element by element basis. So by stories I mean articles or shows, stories on shows, and then the elements meaning like the individual parts of it. We have some article and show grading rubrics that I will share with you. And then there's a couple of subcharts that I have for the different cable news channels, such as CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. So I'll show you those at the end to show how we differentiate between those as well. I missed the most important part, which is questions. I would love for you to ask questions. Give me like 5 minutes to really get into the first things, but then as we go along, go ahead and raise your hand, shout them out. I'm happy to answer them, and we'll leave some time at the end. I'll stick around for questions as well. All right, so how did I end up here talking to you about the media bias chart? I'm a patent attorney. I'm not a journalist. Journalism is not my profession. So 2 years ago, I would have also been very surprised to know that I'd be speaking to anyone, and anyone would care to hear what I had to say about the media landscape. And what I do as a patent attorney is I explain complex concepts through words and pictures. But what I found is that the pictures are really the thing that relay the most understanding when something's complex. So I just remember in the lead up to the 2016 election, being alarmed personally by the kinds of content, some of it you can't really call news, the kind of content people would share on Facebook and Twitter and use that to support their arguments and opinions. And I would be alarmed because people would use things to support their arguments that I would just immediately discredit. I'd say, that's a terrible source. Why are you using that source? But people can't tell necessarily. Unless you're in this world of reading a lot of different news sources, you can't necessarily differentiate because you're just looking at one piece and there's a huge landscape to compare it to. So I thought, you could really map this out. I mean, there are some sources that are better and some sources that are worse, and then some that are more biased this way and some that are more biased this way. So I had this in my head and I put it down on paper. You know, I'm not a graphic designer or anything. I just use my program called Visio that I use for like doing pattern drawings. And I put it on Facebook because I really wanted to explain it to some of my friends. And then at first, like 8 people shared it because I had it on like the private sharing, like the regular setting. I didn't even know there was like a public Facebook sharing setting. And I was like, oh my gosh, 8? That's a lot. That's a lot of people sharing it. I don't think you've ever had anybody share something that you wrote on Facebook 8 times. But like the first time it happens, it's pretty amazing. But then, like a couple months later, somebody who knows how to use Facebook shared it publicly, and they're like, "Hi, I don't know you, but this thing like had 20,000 shares," and then it just kind of went all over the internet. But then people started asking me, "Oh, great! Can teachers and college professors teach, you know, media literacy and journalism? They'd ask me, "Oh, great! Can I use this in my class? Can I print it in my textbook? What data did you use? What is your methodology?" And that really surprised me, that part, because I was shocked that they would want to use that. And I thought, is there really nothing else out there like this? And I looked around and there wasn't. And I started to think about why. And I also started to think about the fact that because people are relying on this, this is a thing that's influencing people. Anything that gets a lot of traction on the internet influences people. And I know that. And therefore I have a responsibility to make it as good as I can. I have a responsibility to make sure that it's as accurate as possible within certain definitions. And it's has as much data as possible. And so I kept working on refining it and developing it and taking in input from journalists and observers and academics and coming up with more and more refined methodology. But then after a certain point, there's only so much that I can do by myself because there's a lot of sources out there and there are a lot of articles for each of these sources. So I started seeing if there would be interested in people helping me with this, and there was. I just recently entered a crowdfunding campaign to take this media bias chart to the next level, which would be like an interactive, dynamic version that would rate sources ongoingly and then provide that data to organizations that would be interested in having that data. So consumers could you rely on the chart in the future for free, but then we'd also have the data behind it that others could use, not only to trust what we're putting out there, but also to use it for other purposes, which I'll get into in a little bit. And so we raised over $30,000 with that crowdfunding campaign, and I'm really excited about that. So that's where I am today. So why a chart? So it's two visual dimensions. There's almost infinite things to measure about news content, but two dimensions people can handle. Quality and political bias are distinct measures. They overlap in a lot of ways, but there are things that are unique to each dimension. And current models for discussing these measures are typically one-dimensional. So what do I mean by that? One is fact-checking. Fact-checking is really important. It's what defines the difference between actual news and fake news, right? But that's not the only problem with the media landscape. My chart actually does not deal very much with fake news at all. Like, there are a few on the bottom there that you could classify as fake news, but here's the chart. There's this whole world of like fake news underneath it that's not even on the chart. There are other kinds of quality problems with news sources besides things that are fact-checkable, because not everything is fact-checkable. If somebody has a statement in an article that you read or a show that you watch that says, government corruption is absolute, that's not a fact-checkable statement. That's an opinion. And so much of the content that we consume is analysis and opinion. So another one-dimensional way to look at news quality bias is just looking at bias. And there are bias rating sites and polls. And particularly when it comes to polls, it's really just about asking the consumer what they think. So if you ask somebody, if you're trying to find out about trustworthiness of a news source, and you ask somebody who's very conservative, is Fox News trustworthy? they will probably tell you yes. But if you ask somebody who is liberal and is Fox News trustworthy, they will tell you no. And that doesn't actually tell you anything about the trustworthiness of the source itself. It just tells you about the political persuasion of the person that you're asking. So the other reason is that modes of criticism and defense of media bias and quality are ad hoc. And the best examples I can give are on Twitter. So Twitter is just ad hoc ideas all the time, everywhere. You all are journalists, are interested in journalism, so I imagine your Twitter feed looks a lot like mine, and it follows a lot of news, so there's tons of hot takes and tons of opinions. And so if people want to talk about how good or bad the news is, they'll say, look at this article from the New York Times and how terrible it was for this reason. Or they'll say, look at this piece of journalism from the New Yorker and how good it was and for this reason. But those are only examples and pieces, that it doesn't give you a picture of the whole landscape. That's why the chart, showing a landscape is helpful. Another reason it's helpful is because of something I like to say, which is all generalizations are false. Now, that was originally the title of my blog when I first started blogging about media and politics, and I had like 4 people who would read it, including sometimes my mom. Right? That's how blogs work. Who wants to read like 6,000 words that I write? And so, all generalizations are false is itself a generalization, which means that it's false. And that some generalizations are actually true. So generalizations themselves are just linguistic constructs, and they're a way that we talk about the media in particular really often. So one way to talk about, so if you're going from like very general to very specific, that's what this line means. So one way people talk about the news is they say, CNN is the worst. So you can have this conversation at Thanksgiving dinner, and you can replace CNN with any other news source or whatever. So that's one way to talk about the news, and it's more general, but it's less true because you can come up with counterexamples. For example, other sources that are worse than CNN, or a time that CNN did a good thing. But it's easy to communicate, and that's why we talk about that. The other way to talk is very specific. So you can say, on June 8, 2012, CNN did this very specific thing, and it was a very specific mistake, and that was bad. And people can really agree on that when you get that granular, right? They did make this mistake this time. So that's more specific, it's more true, but it's hard to communicate. It's like that ad hoc way of talking about the media. So the chart is helpful because you can kind of strike a balance, and you can say, well, CNN is generally here. All right, I'll blow this up on the next slide. But it's a balance between general and specific. It contains some of the nuance, but certainly not all of it. And it's still easy to communicate. You can still have a conversation and you really focus in on exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about the quality or bias of, in this example, CNN. Now, here's CNN right in the middle. I have a blog post entitled, "Everybody Has an Opinion on CNN," because I am told that it should be much higher and much lower and much farther right and much farther left. Okay? So the reason, but we can talk about this because of this taxonomy. So here you can see that it's in the line between analysis and opinion. That's where most of the content is. And it's here on this skews left to this. This says neutral at the top, but it also says balance of biases. People say CNN is not neutral, so I largely agree. I largely agree it's more of a balance of biases, meaning the structure of the shows that would that have us place it in the analysis and opinion vertical are the fact that most shows throughout the day cover approximately 4 to 6 stories, and if it's 4 stories, it's usually like a fire or a hurricane and 3 things that Trump did today. Okay, that's usually the format, and then they'll have like 8 to 10 guests talking about those 4 stories until you're sick of it. And if you like watch 4 hours of this in a row, it's like it really makes you crazy. But the guests are typically, you would have people who are like a little bit left and a little bit right, arguing with each other, or somebody who's very far left and very far right, arguing with each other. So that's where the balance of biases comes in, and the number of A number of commentators shades it this way, and also the topic selection shades it towards the left at the moment. So why is it even important to map out the media landscape like this? I think it's important, and I sense that it's important because identifying the effects that media consumption has on people and politics is really understudied, and it's an area of social science research, I think, that can be expanded. So if you can identify certain things about the media people watch in a meaningful way, you can identify what they do in relation to it. So for example, some content polarizes. There are sections on the chart, the hyperpartisan right and left. You would know this anecdotally just from your own experience, that people who tend to read and watch those that are in the hyperpartisan right and left columns are polarized. You know, they have a hard time getting along with folks who read the other stuff. Some content also radicalizes, and you can see this as well. If you get out even farther to the left and right, people actually take harmful action in the world due to the things that they read. So it's important as a society to identify that. And then some content erodes trust in journalism. That's also of great interest to journalism, or to journalists right now, because it's not necessarily obvious and apparent. And I have some theories on the kind of content that erodes trust in journalism that people don't necessarily think does. I'll give you some examples of that later. All right, so I was going to run through some recent headlines across the spectrum, but I'm going to skip that one. We have other good stuff. All right, so the why, I think, is one thing. The how, since this is important, I'm saying it's important to map the media landscape, how come there are few endeavors or few ways that people are trying to do this right now? And the answer is because it's hard. It's very difficult. Both parts. The taxonomy is hard. The methodology is hard. So that's why tech companies are having a hard time filtering out the kind of content that should run on their platforms. I mean, they have all the resources in the world. They have all the software in the world. They should be able to not have crappy content online. But what's crappy content, right? That's very, very, very difficult to define. And if the only way you can define it is by saying, well, InfoWars, that's really terrible. Like, okay, but that's like literally like the worst mainstream example. And like there's other stuff that's also really harmful. How can we not identify that? So how? The taxonomy. I'm going to go over the vertical column, or the vertical axis of the chart, which is quality. So what makes a news source good? There are a lot of things that make a news source good and a lot of things that make a news source bad. And part of the reason this is hard is because there's almost infinite things to measure when you're looking at one article, let alone when you're looking at all the different articles in all the different formats, right? So it kind of makes intuitive sense that on this vertical axis, good is up here and bad is down here. But that's not really what this axis represents. What it represents is stuff that's more news and stuff that's less news. Here's what I mean. So at the top is original fact reporting and fact reporting. Okay? I'm going to jump ahead to the actual chart. Okay. Original fact reporting and fact reporting at the top. So you see I have the wire services like AP and Reuters up there, and then sources that have a lot of journalists, employ a lot of journalists, and create a lot of original fact reporting up at the top. And as people who are journalists or work with journalists, that kind of makes intuitive sense to you. But the ones right below it are also good news sources. So they're complex analysis or a mix of fact reporting and analysis. And a lot of sources are that, the mix of complex reporting and analysis. For example, The Guardian, The Economist, ProPublica, Financial Times. There's a lot of really good journalism in there, and really good writing too. So you could make the argument that this stuff is actually the best kind of news because it gives context and it's written really well and it's often long form, and that's actually valid. in my first version of the chart, I had complex analysis higher than I had original fact reporting. But the reason I decided to change it was because the news ecosystem would not exist without the original fact reporting. So, and that's what you get Pulitzer Prizes for. So you have, Ronan Farrow's story and then a New Yorker. It took all the grunt work. It took years of investigation and calling people and verifying and, great personal risk to come up with that story. And he rightfully won a Pulitzer Prize. And then thousands of analysis pieces were written based upon that, like in this entire world and in this world and in this world as well. But it was like the genesis of all of that. So that's why we put that at the top. So what makes a news source less news is, analysis and opinion, and there's a ton of that in our news diets. And then what makes a news source not so good? Well, when you start, opinion is fine. There's a place for an opinion. People can certainly make their arguments. But there's opinion that's fair, and then there's opinion that's unfair. So when stories start to get selective or incomplete, or use unfair arguments, like ones that are not exactly based on the assumptions that they say they're based on, that starts to get very questionable. Then you have propaganda / contains misleading info. Those are really two different things. Something can be just propaganda, meaning it's just promoting one side of the story or one particular viewpoint. And you can have contains misleading info, which is as it says. Then there's contains inaccurate and fabricated info, and that's where we get into the actual fake stuff. But I've gotten complaints from sources near the bottom on both sides that will say, hey, our stuff is based in facts. I mean, we cite a lot of sources. Like, we'll even cite Reuters, because it's true. These sources, we'll cite these sources. What I mean by cite is they hyperlink it, right? And being a lawyer, it really bothers me when somebody says that they cited something where they just hyperlink to it. Because you get in trouble if you cite something in a legal document to a court that does not stand for the proposition that you say it stands for, right? So what the citations will look like is, Reuters said that this thing happened, and that thing totally did happen. But then the rest of the article is about some conclusions, like some wild conclusions that they're leaping to based on the fact that the first thing even happened. So anyways, I like to point out that a lot of our a lot of our consumer attention and focus is in this analysis and opinion world, especially when it comes to cable news. So CNN is right there, Fox News is right there, MSNBC is right there, and people rely on this for news a lot, but it is a ton of analysis. And an analogy I like to make is that junk food and junk news are really the same kind of problem. So in the 50s and 60s, when junk food started and processed food, fast food really became widely available, it seemed like a great idea at the time because it was abundant and cheap. But then we realized that there are a lot of bad health effects if you overconsume it, right? And that's the same thing that we're experiencing right now with the news landscape. There's way more news sources, analysis and opinion than ever have been before. And that seems great, and it can be great, but if you focus so much on analysis and opinion, you're really eating the equivalent of just donuts and fries all day. Okay? So this stuff is like your lean meats and your proteins. You really need, and your whole grains, and the news. You need this information to be an informed citizen of society, and you gotta eat, you gotta read. Okay? And there's this other stuff too, which is also good. Like this is still whole grains. Some of it's white bread, right? That's fine. And you can eat it. Everyone eats carbs. You need carbs. Just don't eat only carbs, because then that also causes problems. But again, when you get into the donuts and fries down here, a lot of bad health effects. And then here is like drugs. I like to say it's really bad for you. And in this analogy, Twitter is like candy. And we're all guilty of this, but you know how Twitter is very satisfying, and you get small doses, and it feels good, but if you do it too much, you consume too much of it, it makes you feel sick. So that's what I am advocating here to reduce polarization, because junk food and fast food caused an epidemic of unhealthy outcomes and obesity in this country, and this is causing an epidemic of polarization, extreme polarization.
So in the Daily Cause, like, who are you looking at specifically in Daily Cause to get put onto that rating? Because I mean, more or less, you're looking at a blog, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's multiple different bloggers on there. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I know my stories have ended up on Daily Blog
Mm-hmm.
and on Daily Cause occasionally
Mm-hmm.
back in the day. So how are you making that decision?
Yeah, so it's sample based. So obviously we can't, to the extent people disagree, it's usually because our samples vary, right? And so there are the things, we only have resources to do like a limited set of samples. So we focus on the things that are at the top of the fold, like the lead stories, the things that like you don't have to scroll down to get to, and that informs the rankings. So it doesn't mean that there's not good content on some of these sites. There is good content on some of the sites, even if it's not, even if their overall ranking is lower. But for most sources, the content that gets the most clicks and views and likes tends to be, especially in the analysis opinion section, tends to be stuff that's a little bit more opinion focused and more bias focused, just because that's the audience that it's meant to attract. Yes?
Hi. First off, I wanted to thank you for this. As a student journalist, it's really reassuring to see this stuff. But have you ever, as a student journalist, also, I see another problem prevalent is sensationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought about making a chart for sensationalized news and charting that?
Yeah, so sensationalism is something we roll into this definition of unfair and propaganda. That's really where the sensationalism lives. We don't have it labeled as sensationalism or clickbait. My first version of the chart actually said sensationalism/clickbait, which was like one of the categories. But it's more accurate to describe it as unfairness, because unfairness is just like a broader thing. So sensationalism, things like all caps, huge fonts, huge unnecessary fonts. You know, the things that you teach people, like, hey, if it's got like a bunch of exclamation points, it's like not that great of a news source. Or like if they put like a picture of prison bars over somebody's face on somebody's picture, and they're like not even actually in jail. It's pretty rude. And it's sensational. So those all fall under the category of unfair. And there's like a whole world of things that are unfair when you read. Like name calling, for example, also falls under unfair. All right. So this is also the hard part. So the taxonomy, what defines bias? What's more biased or less biased? So we have most extreme left to most extreme right. This used to say most extreme liberal to most extreme conservative, but left to right really encompasses more concepts, and you can translate this to other regions because you can cast most things on roughly a left to right spectrum. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But this is the US political environment on a left-right continuum. So you have to fix that kind of taxonomy in time and geography. A lot of Canadians really like this chart, but it's not, like our left-right spectrum is different from Canada's left-right spectrum. And folks have asked me to make a Canadian version. I would need Canadian collaborators for that. So I think it is possible to do this in other countries, but you need people who have not only journalism and media landscape knowledge, but they have to have the political knowledge of that particular landscape. So, because that's what this is defined upon. All right, so let me talk about how we anchor this. Because there are a lot of things you can look at in society and say what constitutes the left and the right. So you can look at our elected officials, you can look at what the citizens say via measures like what they say on social media or what you hear in your conversations. It's harder to measure. And you can look at what the media says, because that's in print. So I found that since we're measuring the media and how biased the media is, the best thing to fix to anchor the political spectrum was the positions of our elected officials, because they are written down at some point in time. So there's a Republican Party platform and a Democratic Party platform written every 4 years. Our senators, House of Representatives, they have the platform positions listed on their websites, and they change every 2 years, 4 years, and they change even in between, but they're fixed at certain points in time. So I anchored this this line right here between hyper-partisan and left and skews left as far as political positions is the Democratic National Committee platform, the most recent one. So between skews right and hyper-partisan right is the Republican National Committee platform. So what anchors this line right here between hyper-partisan right and most extreme right is the most extreme positions of current elected officials, all right? Because there's stuff that even they won't say, okay? Not a lot of stuff. Same thing here, okay? So I want to read that down. So like stuff that you would say the most extreme left positions right here. Because there are sources that will say stuff that's even farther, more extreme than that, and more extreme than that. And so we got to capture that on the chart. So this helps us with the problem of moving goalposts, because this line has moved for a bunch of different issues, and people have a sense that one party moves it more often or farther or quicker than another party. I think the moving of the goalposts exists in both parties, and it's something that we have to update frequently. Like this is something that needs to be re-anchored kind of every 6 months or so. Okay, so
you're basing it on societal norms that are changing over time.
yes. So for example, I believe it was like in 2012 where President Obama, before President Obama came out in favor of same-sex marriage explicitly in a TV interview, whether same-sex marriage should be legal was a fairly hyper-partisan left position, because it was not in the position of the Democratic National Party, it was not in the platform. But then, a politician can move these goalposts. People can move these goalposts, the media can move these goalposts, but in this particular instance, President Obama said, I think same-sex marriage should be legal. And so he moved public opinion, and then a few years later, the courts made it the law of the land. And so now, it's more like a skews left to neutral position, because you don't see a lot of, lean right politicians saying, oh, we gotta repeal same-sex marriage. Like that used to be a thing, like really fighting hard against same-sex marriage, and it's not really a thing among these politicians at the moment, okay?
So why wouldn't you base it maybe on a Pew study, for example, that would be saying, they would take a poll of the overall population and make this, what they thought,
I think,
versus what a particular party might think. That seems to be kind of partisan to it. But go ahead.
No, that's totally valid, and there are